In this in-depth tutorial, I'm gonna walk you through my process for transferring a complex design file from Figma to After Effects, set it up using clever techniques to animate it as easily as possible, including expressions and the essential graphics panel, adding depth to the design using the advanced 3D render engine, and bringing it all together with the final animation. This is a packed tutorial, so get ready to take some notes. Hit that like button, subscribe if you're not already, and let's get into Figma. One of my favorite features of Figma is the community aspect. There are just so many incredibly talented designers that have made professional design files available for you to use and to learn from. And in the case of this weather app UI design, it's just a masterclass in how a pro-level designer puts together something this complicated in a Figma document. So Axonvati, hopefully I'm saying that right, has graciously made this available to use and to learn from, more importantly. And if we take a look at the file, they've just laid this out in such a professional way. Like I said, it is a masterclass in what a pro-level designer does inside of Figma. So I would encourage you to browse files like this to see how people who are more experienced than you in Figma have set things up. And on this cover page over here on the left side, if you're not familiar with Figma, this is the hierarchy kind of section. There's the cover page, and this designer has set up the license agreement right here. It's also shown in the actual page for the product. You can see the Creative Commons license here, but just be a smart internet user. Make sure that whatever you're looking at, if you're going to use it commercially, that you actually have the right to use it commercially. This is a personal use license only, so just be aware of that as you're browsing the community on Figma or anywhere on the internet. And by the way, if you are a motion designer who needs to learn Figma, I have just the class for you. It's called Figma for Motion Designers. There's a link down in the description if you want to learn more. But I really like this cover layout, and this is kind of what I want to recreate inside of After Effects. I'd like to add some 3D dimension to that frame to make it look like it's on an actual phone, having this really cool blurring going on behind this kind of transparent weather widget here. It's all really cool. That's what I'd like to recreate in After Effects. So how are we going to get from Figma into After Effects? Well, Overlord, of course. It is the easiest way to get from Figma to After Effects, and I think this is a perfect use case for it. It's a very complicated design, but I think we're gonna be able to pull it off. Let's take a look at some of the other pages we have over here. The iOS page, this is kind of the standard layout of what these designs would look like on the phone. There's a lot more going on here than what we're seeing because there are clip groups that are clipping things off, but what's even more impressive is this prototype page, which again, if you wanna learn how to do certain things, especially prototyping in Figma, check out project files like this because I can run this prototype and get a mocked up interactive version of this design as if it were already on an iPhone. And I can do things like move this drawer around. I can expand it up further if I grab it and drag it all the way to the top. To transition between different frames, I can go back here and click on this menu button right here. It slides over it, and this list is even swipeable, so you can scroll through this. This is a really great showcase of what's capable inside of Figma. So let's close out of that, and I want to point out the last page here is the components. Again, what a masterful layout of this UI design. If we go through this, it's just so well laid out, from the text styles to the colors, the widgets, the app icons. Everything is so nice and organized. Even the frames themselves have styling like drop shadows in the background. This just feels like a very coherent design package, and it's something that I want to strive towards myself with my own designs. But what I'm gonna do is go back to the iOS page. I think this is where I'm going to pull my elements from into After Effects, but I'm actually not gonna change anything about this document just so I always have this to come back to. Instead, I'm going to grab this iOS frame and copy it, and I made a new document already, a blank design document called Phone UI that I'm just going to paste this into. So paste, here we have all the same elements, and now I can do whatever I want with this non-destructively to the original document. Now I wanna make this frame 1920 by 1080, so again, with that selected, I'll just type in 1920 1080, and I'll center up the contents. So let's grab these two frames right here, and I'll just center it up. It doesn't really matter because I'm gonna change stuff inside of After Effects, but I do wanna take the rounding off of this frame, so let's just turn that down to 0. And with that selected, I would like to actually try to get just the background into After Effects first, but I know that the background is being styled partially by the frame itself, and I don't want the contents of that frame to move with it. So what I'm gonna do is just temporarily move these two elements outside of the hierarchy of this iOS, and I'm actually just gonna rename this background. And I know there's a group in here called background, so I'm just gonna rename this background elements because the background fill is actually coming from this frame. All right, so let's actually transfer some things to After Effects using Overlord. So I need to open up the plugin. If you've had it open recently, it's gonna show up in your recents. Otherwise, go over to Plugins and Widgets and click on Overlord. And so here's our little tab. We have some options with how we're gonna transfer things over to After Effects, and they're all underneath this button right here. So we've got push selection, split layers, and single layer. I'm gonna encourage you to use split layers as often as possible because that's going to give you the most one-to-one representation of what we have in Figma inside of After Effects. It's going to give you the most successful rebuild of designs, especially ones this complicated. We also have the option to pre-comp frames, so every frame could come in as a pre-comp, and that helps clean things up a lot, but I kind of prefer to do that manually so I can pick and choose which elements I want to be pre-comped in After Effects. Not all the time, but in this case, I'm gonna leave it unchecked. Now, before I go ahead and hit push selection, I'm going to first create a new comp from the frame. So I'm just gonna click that button, and that built a comp right inside of After Effects with the same name, so background. I'm gonna go ahead and make a folder and call this comps, and let's bring that into that folder. I actually don't want to call this background though. I'm going to call this screens source. And I want to check my composition settings to make sure this is long enough. It's only 5 seconds long. Let's just make it a minute long just for safety so that all of the layers, when they get brought in, they'll be made a minute long as well. The frame rate's going to default to 60 when you're transferring things from Figma. I'm going to drop that down to 30. I don't need it to be at a frame rate of 60. But with that done, I'm just going to make sure my project file is saved. I had already saved this myself, but the reason I'm going to save that is because when we transfer things that have raster images, Overlord can automatically put those images in a folder relative to your project file, which is what I have set up here. Under the System tab, I have this relative checkbox checked. That's going to make an Overlord folder in the same location as your project file and put all of its raster images right there, instead of prompting you asking where it should put them every time. So now that that's all set up, let's go back to Figma. And with that background frame selected, I'm going to send it all over with push selection. And it's rebuilding right before our eyes. Did not take much time at all. We've got 6 new layers, and that looks like a pretty good representation of what we saw inside of Figma. Now we've got a little bit of darkness around the edges here just because of the way that it was built. We've got this adjustment layer that's blurring some things. This is recreating the background blur element that we had in Figma. And the repeat edge pixels, that's really what we need to fill out those dark areas. But otherwise, this looks pretty great. So what we've got right here is a guide layer that is the size of the elements within that frame, and that is an automatically generated guide layer that acts as the parent, preserving the hierarchy of everything underneath it, but then I can just move this around freely. I can also go to the group section of Overlord and click on pre-comp to put all of those elements instantly into a pre-comp in the exact same place, and that just cleans everything up a little bit. Now I'm gonna grab both of those elements and I'm going to pre-comp them again because I'd like that background color to exist in that same place, and I'll just rename this entire thing background. So let's take a look at our project. We've automatically gotten this Overlord folder pre-comps inside of that. And just for consistency, I'm going to rename this comp here as background as well. Now, this is much larger than it needs to be, and there's a lot of empty space around that frame, but since we use the pre-comp function of Overlord, all the positioning is preserved here, as long as I don't move this around. If I wanted to change that, what I could do is come back into this pre-comp, and there is a specific radial gradient on this shape, so I don't want to just scale this up or scale it to fit. I want to preserve that gradient, so instead what I would need to do is find out what the composition size is. So I'm just gonna copy the width and then remember 1457 for the height. And then I'll go to the properties panel, uncheck this, paste, say 1457. And now the size of the rectangle is correct. I just need to center it by pressing Control Command plus the home button. And then what I could do is double click on the shape layer to bring the gradient controls up and just move it to the left a little bit so it's back to where it kind of was before. But now we filled out that whole background and we've got that element ready to go. I'm just gonna lock it so I don't move it around, and let's start transferring some of the actual phone elements. Let's go ahead and move these elements back into this background frame just to start. And let's go ahead and try this weather home frame. And this is a lot. Like I said, there are a ton of things in this hierarchy and a lot of things that we're not even seeing. Like these widgets down here from the prototype that we looked at. If I expand this out a little bit more, you can see that there's a bunch of elements over here that are getting cropped off. I probably don't need that. I'm not planning on incorporating the swiping at all, but let's just keep it simple. Let's just transfer it over and see what happens. But actually, first, what I want to do is grab the entire frame, and I'm going to transfer that as an image just to have as a reference. So I have an exact representation of what I'm seeing in Figma inside of After Effects. So I'm gonna grab that background frame, and I'm actually gonna rename this. Why don't we call this the same thing, Screens Source, and I'm going to click on the Rasterize Selection button. That's gonna automatically send over a raster image. It might take a little bit of time to render that as a PNG, but there we go. We've got it inside of After Effects, and I'm gonna go ahead and right click on it and say guide layer, just so that it is sure to never render. It's just a guide layer for me to reference. And let's call this Screen Source Reference. And I'm just gonna change the label color so I know that's my reference layer. But now I'll have something to compare it to once I start transferring elements over. So one more time, let's jump into Figma, grab the frame for this home screen, and we're going to transfer that using push selection. And this might take a little bit of time, but let's see. And there we have it, 193 layers created. And yeah, it took a little bit of time to transfer, but you know what? It was a lot faster than if I were to do it manually. If you've had any experience transferring things from Figma to After Effects, you know that that was an incredible time saver. And no, it is not 100% ready to go, but it looks like everything carried over, and we can definitely clean this up fairly easily. Transferring things the old way with exporting SVGs and having to do lots of prep work inside of Illustrator and still not having everything be preserved is a nightmare. Overlord is absolutely the best way to get from Figma to After Effects. So let's take a look at what we've got. In the background here, I want to make sure that we're not being confused. So I'm going to grab that reference image and just shoot that back to the top and turn it off. So we're definitely getting something that looks different. And the biggest thing that I'm noticing right now is this image right here. It's not being cropped correctly. So let's isolate that. I'm going to press X to jump to that layer in my timeline, and let's take a look. It has a track matte right here that is set to layer 192. This is the mask that was generated for it, and it looks like it's just a little too big. I think that actually might be the size of the image. And if we look at the layer just above the image, that actually is sized correctly. Remember, Overlord is going to generate a guide layer for every frame when we're using the split selection transfer method. So what I'm going to do is just solo these couple of layers for a second, and actually this one too in the background, that's also the same size as this image, and it's also parented to it. So this guide layer is moving all of those around. That's great. But what I want to do is just basically take this shape and replace this frame, which is being used as a track matte, with it. So I'm actually just going to delete this mask layer, and I'm going to instead grab the track matte, drag it to the Weather Home 1, and just make sure to turn that layer back on so it's not invisible. But just like that, we've now trimmed or clipped that image to where it should be. Now, I told you there were a lot of elements that we couldn't see in Figma that were being clipped off. Looks like that clipping wasn't preserved, but like I said, I don't need all of these icons over here. So I'm gonna try and find these elements, and I'm actually gonna just pre-comp them because that will make it easier for me to just delete them all at once. Now, this one has a lot more to it. Again, I probably don't need these ones off to the side, but just to make things simpler for myself, I'm gonna pre-comp that as well. I know I don't need to individually edit all of these numbers and things, so just combining it into one pre-comp is gonna make it easier for me to clip it to this home screen. Now, like I said, some things are not transferring over exactly right, so let's just take a look at our reference image again. We can see that there are some slight differences in the fonts. This is all stuff that's just part of migrating from one app to the next. Adam is constantly improving Overlord, and hopefully we will get there to where getting a one-to-one transfer is a reality. But even just since we've added Figma support, so many things have improved with Overlord. So I think the future looks pretty bright. And what we have now is just, like I said, so much better of a workflow than what we had before. Now, I'm not gonna spend the next hour just refining absolutely everything about this file, but I do wanna point out some key things that I want you to be aware of, like this house. This clearly does not look correct, so we need to figure out, why does this image of the house not look like what we had inside of Figma? If I turn this reference back on and off, you can see it's drastic. It's a very different rendering of that house. So I'm just gonna jump back to Figma, and I'm gonna deep select by controller command clicking here, and there's the house image. So this is called house. What I wanna do is look at the image fill, which there's part of the reason. There is a color fill on top of the image set to 81%. I could recreate that in After Effects pretty easily, but I'm not gonna go there just yet. Next, I wanna look at the actual image fill, and there we go. There's some exposure, some tint, some highlights, shadow adjustments. Those don't transfer over with the split selection, but because because this is a raster image, if I sent it over as a rasterized selection, it would render these adjustments and bring it over. So actually, that's what I'm gonna do. I just wanna make sure that I'm over that same layer in After Effects. So I'm going to search for house, and there's my house image layer. Close that, press X again to isolate that part of the timeline. So there's my layer, and I wanna render this just above that layer. So let's go back to Figma. I'm gonna grab that house component and I'm going to rasterize selection. There it is right in place, right above the layer that I had selected. And what I wanna do is use this layer, which has that alpha transparency, that alpha matte, as a matte for this new rendered layer, which doesn't have that transparency because of that semi-transparent fill that was placed over it. So what I'm gonna do is simply just grab that track matte, pick whip, use the original house as the matte, and there we go. We've got our house looking exactly how we had it inside of Figma. I'm just gonna rename this house matte, and this will be our house layer. I need to make sure this is also parented to the house group. There we go. And to clean it all up one more time, I'm going to pre-comp that. So now that is one single element and it's easier to work with. Now I'm gonna take a few minutes here to pre-comp things, clean this up and get it into a format that is ready for us to animate. Okay, I did a lot of cleanup here, and we've got something that is a very close representation to what we had with our reference image. It's not 100% there, but I'm not gonna obsess over the little details for this video. For what we need, this is gonna get the job done. So I'm gonna leave that reference image off, and let's take a look at what I've got. I've got one comp here that is going to have all these kind of widgets for the different cities inside of it. There are a bunch of elements to make this possible, but I also have all of those widgets in its own pre-comp as well, so that can move around if we need it to. And then in the other comp, we've got all the elements that make up the home screen, and this is all organized. Again, I could move things around if I wanted to, but really what I'd like to do now is add in some actual 3D geometry so we can kind of recreate that cover image that was at more of a perspective view and see some actual depth here. So let's start by adding a new shape that's the same size as the phone. So I'm actually just gonna jump into one of these and grab the background shape here, copy and paste it, and this will be our phone's geometry. So I'm gonna call this phone, and I'm going to make that 3D and drag it down to the bottom, actually just above the background. And I wanna go straight to this little menu right here. I wanna use the advanced 3D render engine, so I'm gonna switch over to that. And that is going to get rid of my gradient fill. It's actually still there, it's just not supported on 3D layers with this renderer. So just to make things simpler, I'm gonna get rid of that. I'm going to add a fill right there and bring it into that same group. So there's our fill. I just need to find the color that we had originally. So let's find that background color, which is somewhere in this dark blue. I'll just grab that one and we'll paste that onto the fill of this rectangle. So this is our base geometry. How do we add some depth? Well, we need to go to the geometry options. So this is where we can add some extrusion depth. We're not gonna be able to see it straight on though, so I'm just gonna rotate it. I press W to get to the rotation tool there, and then I can just extrude this out very simply. So that's gonna give us some 3D geometry to work with and to attach this artwork to. So I'm gonna go ahead and make both of these 3D as well. And I'm gonna grab the parent pick whip for both of them at the same time while holding Shift and let go over the phone layer, and that's going to align them, move all of the transformations to the parent layer. And we're getting some intersections here. So what I need to do is bring up the position of both of these and just bump out the Z-axis by -1 pixel. So now it's just above the surface of that geometry, but it's parented to it. So now I can grab the rotation of this layer or the orientation, move it around however I need to, and it's going to work just fine. We're still getting that weird intersection because we're seeing both of these screens at the same time. So I'm just gonna leave the home one visible for now, and we can see that. So that's looking good. But instead of rotating this phone around, what I wanna do is zero that back out, and I'm going to add a new camera. So we'll go up to Layer, New, Camera, and we'll make this the preset of 135 millimeters. So that's a zoomed in focal length, and that'll compress a lot of the perspective here. So I'll click OK. Nothing really changed because we need to now change the camera angle, but I want to do this in a very controllable way. I could just use the camera controls and rotate this around, but as you can see, because I'm using a 2-node camera, and I was using the orbit around cursor tool instead of the point of interest, it was rotating things around really weird. So what I like to do instead, when I'm not planning on doing a bunch of crazy camera movements, or even sometimes when I am, is set up controllers for the camera that make it easier to manipulate. And my favorite way to do that is using Void, which is a free tool from Battle Axe that has way too many uses to list out right now. But what Adam has recently added is the ability to just select a camera layer and click the Void button, and that generates a shape layer null object essentially in the same place as the point of interest of your 3D camera, and then it parents the camera to it. So what we're seeing now is a visible layer control that represents the point of interest of the camera and acts as a controller. So I can rotate it around in any axis and it will be nice and centered in my scene. So what I'm gonna do is call this void camera X rotation and bring up the rotation by pressing R. And this one I'm going to use just to rotate it back a little bit. So that way we're looking at it more from that lower angle. But if I were to grab like the Y rotation and the Z rotation, it would take a lot of back and forth to get the exact angle that I want. So instead I'm gonna undo and just keep this the X rotation, duplicate this and call it Y rotation. And then I'm going to open up the rotation, make sure to zero out the X, and you can see now it's aligned to the surface of the phone. And what I wanna do is parent the X rotation control to the Y rotation control. And this one I'm only going to use for Y rotation. And then I'm gonna do this one more time. So let's duplicate, open up the rotation, rename this Z rotation, parent the Y rotation to the Z rotation, and now I can rotate the Z axis while preserving the X and Y axis rotation. So it just makes it a lot easier to make this kind of a movement, always knowing that Z axis rotation is going to be aligned to the other two. So I'm gonna zero out that Y rotation and let's play around with the Z and the X. This might actually be all that I need. So I think I'm gonna put it at about that angle, maybe rotate it a little bit that direction, and I think that's pretty good. Now, if I wanted to get a little bit closer here, let me just collapse all these layers. I could always go back to the camera, bring up the position, and then just increase that Z-axis value to move in and out. But the highest level of the parent hierarchy here is what I'm going to want to use to move the camera around if I want to animate it. But as I do this, you can see that's keeping the angle of rotation locked in place. If I turn this camera off, you can see none of that rotation was applied to the phone. It's just the rotation of the camera that's giving us that angle, and I think that's gonna work for now. I'm just gonna shut off the visibility of those three void layers, and what I'd like to do is have this phone slide into place where it comes up at that same angle from off screen, and then maybe these widgets swipe over a little bit, and then we click on this button and that moves the whole screen over to the cities list. So let's go through that motion. First of all, let's get the phone moving into this position. So I'm gonna press P, bring up that position and set a keyframe, and I'll move that forward a little bit. And then I'm gonna grab this Y position. Again, because I rotated the camera and not the phone, this Y axis is going to be aligned to that angle. So I'm just gonna move it down off the screen with that single property. And I'm gonna easy ease right into that keyframe, jump into my graph editor. I'm using the speed graph right now, and I'm just gonna strongly ease into that position. So it comes up into place. Maybe we should add in a little bit of rotation as well, just to make that a little more dynamic. So I'll press R to bring up the rotation, and let's just have the phone kind of rotate into place. So again, I'll set a keyframe there, press U to isolate the keyframes, back this up, and we'll rotate it maybe towards the camera a little bit, and do that same kind of ease. So F9 to easy ease, go into my graph editor, and just ease that out to 100%, making sure that comes to a full rest. Play that back, and now that shoots into place with a little bit more movement. I just need to make sure that goes all the way off the screen at the start. Okay, I like that. So at about this point, why don't we have the widgets swipe over? And to do that, what I wanna do is make that controllable from this comp. I don't wanna be animating in a pre-comp, then jumping back here to check the timing. I wanna be able to do it all here, and that's really easy to do with the Essential Graphics panel in After Effects. So I'm going to jump into that comp. I'm gonna find this layer, and there we go. This is the layer that I need to adjust that X position value. So the way I wanna do this is actually by creating another controller using Void, because there's a feature here that zeroes out essentially the position property and other properties as well. If I expand this up a little bit, I have zero rotation and zero scale enabled, and void visibility is on. I'm actually gonna uncheck that. I don't need to see the void, I just need the controls. But this zero rotation, zero scale, what that means is if I run the void script with that layer selected, it creates that void in the exact same place at the exact same scale and the exact same rotation, and then parents this layer to it, effectively making the relative relative position, scale, and rotation 0 or 100% scale. Cinema 4D calls this freeze transformations. Lots of other apps have this as an option. After Effects doesn't, but it does now because of Battleaxe creating Void for you, completely free again. Head to battleaxe.co/void to get this for free. But now that it's a 0 value, I can always know how to get back to this exact position without having to memorize the actual position values. So what I want to do is just separate the dimensions by right-clicking and saying separate dimensions. X position is all I need here. I can change this to any value and then just type in 0 and it's back where it was because of our void layer. But I just want to right-click on this layer and all the way down at the bottom, I know this is off my screen recording, but there's add property to essential graphics. And when you do that, it'll automatically open up this panel, which I have so little screen real estate when I'm recording here, but let's see. That added it to the essential graphics panel, which allows me to actually modify it right here. This is a cool way to be able to just grab these values and change them. But as you can see, that's actually very sensitive. So I'm gonna just zero that out again. And let's just call this X scroll. So X scroll is the name of the control. If you're not familiar with essential properties, I have an AE Genius video explaining why you should be using them. You can watch that now. But adding that property to the essential graphics panel also makes that property available in a comp that it's nested in, which in this case is right here. Now we have an essential property section and that property that we defined is right there. So I can now swipe this around, scroll those widgets right within this comp, and it actually doesn't even affect the contents of this comp, meaning that I could have multiple instances of this pre-comp and this property would independently control each instance. So if you're not using essential graphics, you absolutely should be. All right, let's zero out that value again, and I think it was right about there that we want this swipe to happen. So I'm gonna keyframe that X scroll property and then go forward a little bit, and then we're just gonna have it kind of swipe over until it reaches that edge. All right, we've got our values set. Now let's go into the graph editor and I'm going to easy ease them again. So F9 on the keyboard, and I wanna just really strongly ease into this second one. I'll leave the first one as it is, and that should look like somebody kind of just flicked it over. So there it just previewed. Let's play it one more time. Yeah, that definitely looks like somebody's just kind of quickly swiping it. Maybe it should happen just a little bit later. Since we set up that essential graphics link, we don't have to go into that pre-comp and mess with the keyframes there. It's all done right here, and I think that looks great. So we swipe across those widgets. Now we want to have a little tap on this menu right here that shifts the whole screen over. So we need to just make a little element that looks like somebody's tapping that. Why don't we do it with a circle? I'm going to go to my ellipse tool and turn off the stroke. I'll make the fill just something bright white, maybe a little purpley like this background, and I'll hold shift while double clicking on the ellipse tool to make a perfect circle. All right, this is going to be our finger press, and we're going to make this smaller. So let's go to our properties panel and just size that down. We'll make that 3D, and let's parent that to the home screen. So I'm gonna use that parent pick whip, hold shift, and drag it to that home screen layer, and let's just drag this down above those layers. And now it's aligned so I can move this around. I'm gonna need to lift it off just by 1 pixel, again, so there's no intersection. So -1 right there on the Z-axis. And then let's turn the opacity down. So I'm gonna find that property, opacity, lower that until it's just visible, but it's not covering up what's underneath it, and we'll just size this a little bit more. Let's zoom in here and just align it right over that button. And this is where it needs to end up, but we should probably have something indicating that it's coming to this position so we can get a little bit of eye trace going on. So let's just set a position keyframe there, and why don't we just back up a little bit and we'll have it come up and from the left a little bit. Actually, I think it would make more sense if it came from these widgets, right? So let's drop it down, and we could even incorporate that into our animation. So let's have that visible when the swipe happens as well, which is right here. So I'll back it up a little bit. Let's get rid of that second keyframe just for a second. This should start over here and swipe it across to the left. So this is our starting position, and then we're just gonna have it kind of flick over a little bit. Again, easing into that second keyframe very strongly, and let's see what that looks like. Yeah, pretty good. Let's have it just move right over to the right side again a little bit more softly, close to where it was after that swipe has happened, and we can ease off a little bit on that influence. So it swipes over and then moves back to where it was, kind of representing that thumb. I think to keep things simple, I'm just gonna let it sit there the whole time so that I don't have to animate it in, and that'll just be our thumb indicator. All right, so after it swipes, then it needs to travel down and to the right. So let's just reposition this using the 3D controls, get that nice and square over that little button. And let's have it kind of size down a little bit to indicate being pressed and maybe get a little bit less transparent. So I'm gonna press T to bring up the opacity. Actually, we set that in the opacity for the shape. So I'm gonna set a keyframe right there, and I'm gonna set a keyframe on the size, press U to isolate those keyframes. And then I'll go forward just a couple of frames and let's increase the opacity, lower the size just a little bit to indicate something is being pressed. And let's easy ease into these keyframes. And then over, a little bit longer time, we'll copy and paste these keyframes and easy ease into them. And let's go into our graph editor and just make that nice and strong. So it's gonna kind of just tap down. I think that could probably happen even a little faster. So I'm gonna move these keyframes over a bit. And there we go. Now that's clearly indicating that something is being pressed. Why don't we just copy and paste those keyframes to align with this swipe as well. So I'll just copy and paste them there. And now let's play that whole thing back, just paying attention to that movement. Since that moves so fast, you don't really see the thumb press, but whatever, I'm just gonna leave it there because it's already there. And now at that moment, when the button is pressed, I want everything on the screen essentially to move over to that cities list. But I wanna do it in a way that kind of looks like a drawer or another layer being swiped on top of this one. So I don't want this to completely move off the phone. I want it to just shift over and maybe have a little bit of a blur and fade out a little bit as well. So how should we set this up? Let's take a look at just this home screen for a second. I essentially want this to move over. I want it to blur out, and it obviously needs to be cropped to that same size. So what I'm gonna do is duplicate it to use as a matte. I'll call this weather home screen matte. Now I would really like to be able to just come over to the track matte column and use that layer as a track matte, but unfortunately 3D layers don't support track mattes in the advanced 3D render engine, so I can't. So what I'm gonna do instead is pre-compose the two different screens into one layer, and then I can composite these two screens together in a pre-comp, but still animate them out here using the Essential Graphics panel. So let's set that up by selecting all three of these layers and pre-composing them. I'm gonna make sure all of them are on. Control-Shift-C or Command-Shift-C on a Mac, and we're gonna call this phone screen. We're gonna move all the attributes into the new composition, which is gonna take a little bit of work to get back to where we were because we don't actually want these to be 3D anymore. So inside the pre-comp, I'm removing that 3D layer switch, and my layers are off the screen to the bottom. So let's just move those back to the center by pressing Controller Command plus the Home button to align it to the center. All of our scale is still set to 100, so that's good. I'm gonna go ahead and get rid of these drop shadows just for now, and I'll apply them later in the main comp. But those are our phone screens that I can move around, and let's see, this is the one I was going to use as a matte, and I still will do that, but I have a lot of extra room around this frame that I don't need, so I'm gonna find out what the dimensions of this comp are, 390 by 844, and I'm gonna match that here. So 390 by 844, and now it's cropped to the size of the screens. Great. I want this layer to start off to the side here and then end up in the center. And I want this layer to move from where it is off to the left about halfway. So remember, this background layer is just gonna be used as a matte. So let's go ahead and set both of these to use that layer as a track matte. And let's bring up the position for these two layers. It actually brought up the X scroll position since that is a position value as well. I don't need that anymore, we've already set that up. But what I do wanna do is separate the dimensions of these two layers, again, just so I can have access to the X position value. So let's grab both of these, add them to the Essential Graphics panel. And actually I got an error because I'm adding it to the wrong comp. So I'm gonna undo that. We're gonna make sure that we go to the primary of this phone screen comp here in my Essential Graphics. So there we go. And then I will add those properties to the Essential Graphics. So we've got the weather cities X position, the weather home screen X position. And why don't we go ahead and zero those out with a void. So I'm just gonna add a void for each of those layers. Now those values are 0. Make sure I turn weather cities back on. And now we can jump back to our main comp, which obviously doesn't look correct because when we pre-composed those layers, it took the 3D switch off. So let's turn that back on. Make sure to parent that layer to the phone geometry while holding Shift. That moves it to the phone and we should be back in business. I just need to lift that off by 1 pixel on the Z axis. And now we've got our phone screen attached again. Obviously it's showing the wrong screen, but fortunately we have these two controls that'll allow us to fix that. So I'm just gonna slide this off to the right edge until it's not visible anymore. So I'm just gonna say 400 to be safe. gonna give myself some more room here. We'll let this animation play out where the phone comes up, it swipes those widgets to the left and then taps the button. So right there at that moment, this is where the home screen needs to slide over, but only about this far as the other screen replaces it. So let's set a keyframe here, go forward maybe 15 frames, and then move this over to the left. Strongly ease out of that second keyframe, and let's just easy ease out of the first one. So that's the basic movement. Okay, let's bring in the second layer to replace it in the same timing. So between these two same points in time, and I'm just gonna zero the position out. Now you can kind of see what I was talking about. I want this to slide out over top of the other one. I just need to have the same easing between these keyframes. So I'm actually gonna just re-ease all of those, go into the graph editor, and then strongly ease into the second keyframes at the same time. And now those easings match. So there we go, we got one screen replacing the other, but there are a few things that I'd like to change about it without having to actually animate them. So let's go back into our pre-comp. And what I like to see is when this layer is coming in and this one is moving off, I'd like to see this one blur out a little bit and maybe even fade into a solid color a little bit more. So let's go over to the effects and presets, and I'm gonna search for Gaussian blur there. And that's gonna let me blur this out. And then I also wanna add a tint effect. And on this tint effect, I'm gonna turn it off just for a second. I wanna sample this kind of dark blue color, and that's what I want it to kind of fade out to. So I want it to blur, and I want it to fade. But I wanna do this in a little bit of a fun way using expressions, because I don't wanna set keyframes for all this. I want it all to be driven by the motion of that layer sliding off to the left. So to do that, I'm gonna start with just the blurriness. Let's turn off the tint, and I'm going to Alt or Option click on that blurriness stopwatch. And what I wanna do is define a variable for that X position value so that I can reference it easily. So I'm going to say for constant, X position, POS equals transform.position, actually X position because our dimensions are separated, and just finish that off with a semicolon. So now I have that as a variable and I can write my expression. So I'm gonna give myself a little more room here. Let's make this bigger again, and we're gonna drop down and we're going to say linear, and then into the parentheses of this linear expression, we'll say X position. This is the value that I want to pay attention to, add a comma, and I need 4 values. The minimum and maximum value of the X position, and the minimum and maximum values that I want for the blurriness property to correlate to. So for the X position, we're gonna say between a value of 0 and negative, I'm not exactly sure what the value was, but somewhere around 200, and then another comma and the other 2 values. So when this layer is at a value of 0, centered in the screen, I want the blurriness to be 0, and when it's at a value of negative 200 on the X axis, I want it to be around 22.4. So I could type in a hard value, or I could just type the word value, and then it will go to whatever I set that number to. Okay, so I'm gonna just add a semicolon at the end, click off, and then let's see what happens now with this effect being driven by the X position. If we grab that X position and move it around, you can see that it is kind of working, but it's kind of inverted. And this is something that I learned about the linear expression that can really trip you up. I put my values in order of the way that I wanted them to be referenced, which was 0 to negative 200. The thing is, the linear expression is going to take the minimum value that you enter in that range and make that the minimum. Just because I put them in this order doesn't make this the minimum value and this the maximum value. It actually looks at the value and chooses which one is minimum and which one is maximum. So I need to grab this value and just move it over there. So we're now saying our range is from negative 200 to 0, and when it's at negative 200, that's when we want it to be at the value of whatever we set the blurriness to. And when it's at a value of 0 on the X position, then we want it to be at a value of 0 on the blurriness. That should clear things up, and now when I move this over to the left, the blurriness is going to automatically increase all the way up to a value of negative 200, which is pretty much right where I wanted it. So I think we're gonna just leave that there, but now we wanna apply the same thing to the amount to tint property of our tint effect. So I'm just gonna copy this expression. I'm gonna go into the tint and Alt or Option click on Amount to Tint and paste that same expression. Don't need to change anything about it. And as I move this over, the tint is going to increase at the same time as the blurriness. I don't have to do any extra animating. And because I set this up with Essential Properties, back in this comp, as it moves over, you can see that that blurriness and that tint is being applied with this instance of the comp. Now, I think I could increase the blurriness a little bit. So let's just go back into here, increase that value. Remember, whatever I have this set to is what it will get to. So I'm gonna change it up to 50, and now that gets a whole lot blurrier, and I think that's gonna work out. So let's get out of this graph editor. And another thing that I'm noticing is that the phone iOS time and this information at the top, that all should just stay where it is. So I'm gonna jump in here and I'm gonna go into this pre-comp and I'm going to find those elements. So I'm just gonna scroll down here and I think this one right here, yes, that's the iPhone 13 UI. I'm just gonna cut it out of this comp and paste it in the same place here. That way the screen contents can move around independently of those elements. And on the weather cities screen, I'm just gonna turn that same element off, making sure that this iPhone 13 is on top of everything else. And now that should stay in place as those other elements move around underneath it. And that's exactly what's happening. Great, so we've got our little interaction. It's swipeable, it's all controllable by a few keyframes, and our phone now comes into place, swipes across, taps into this screen. Now let's just have that thumbprint swipe up one more time and have all these elements just move to the bottom of the list, kind of like we did with the widgets on the home screen. So right about here, this is where I want that swipe to happen. So I'm gonna go into the cities and let's set up that same control for the widgets. So I'm gonna select that layer, bring up the position and separate the dimensions. And let's zero that out by using a void control. And we'll add that property to the essential graphics. I just need to make sure I'm in the right comp. So let's go from our primary phone screen to setting that to weather cities. And I'm gonna grab that Y position of the widgets layer, add that to the essential graphics. And now we've got a control that allows us to swipe that up and down. But I wanna use that same technique that we had before where when this swipes up far enough, this search bar disappears and everything above it that is where this is overlapping gets blurred out. So we need to do a couple of things very similar to the same expressions that we used in the other comp. So I'm just gonna find the guide layer that controls that, which is this one right here called extra, and pre-comp that. So now that all lives in its own comp. And we're gonna do that same linear expression and tying the opacity of this layer. So I'm gonna press T to bring up the opacity, and the Y position on the widgets is the one that we want. So this Y position, when that increases or decreases from 0 to a negative number. So let's reference that in our expression. I'll Alt or Option click on there and we'll type out const Y position equals, and then we'll grab our property pick whip and drag that down to the Y position of the widgets layer. All right, so that's gonna reference that property. And then we'll drop down a couple lines and we'll type our linear expression, Y position, referencing that line of code, and then we need to define our 4 values. So the minimum value is gonna be, let's just say -200 again. I don't know if that's the right value, but we'll say -200 to 0. And the second range is going to be 0 opacity when it's at this -200 and 100% opacity when it's at a value of 0 on the Y position. So we'll apply that and then we'll modify this value to see what it does. So it's working, just -200 is way, way too high of a value. So we need to change this so that by, I'd say this point, so why don't we say -30, that needs to be completely faded out. So I'm gonna go into this expression, and in that range, when this goes down to a value of -30, that's when this should be 100% transparent. So now as this moves up, that disappears. And I just noticed that this moon is getting cut off. I should be able to fix that just by collapse transforming that pre-comp. And there we go. Now we can see beyond, that's not gonna get cropped off anymore. But now as this scales up, that's going to fade out. And I think that's gonna work just fine. But we now need to have that blur layer. So to do that, I'm going to just make another rectangle. So let's just double click on the rectangle tool, and I'm gonna make this an adjustment layer, and then I'm gonna search for Gaussian blur again and drag that out onto this adjustment layer. So I'm gonna call this VG blur, and this is gonna blur out anything underneath it. So let's move it down just above the widgets layer. And I think it's okay that it's gonna blur out the background as well. That shouldn't be a problem. And I'm not too worried about these feathered edges either, because over here in our main comp, this is being cropped by the pre-comp in here. So I don't think that blur is gonna be an issue. We just need to move that layer up so that it's only blurring out things that overlap the UI right here. So now that that's set up, as I move the widgets layer up, you can see that it hits that point and it starts to blur out. I think to make it even a little easier to read that UI, I could also add a tint effect, just like we did in the other comp, and just kind of match these background colors and back it off a little bit, just so it gets a little darker and it's easier to see. So there we go. Now that's gonna blur out, tint a little bit darker, and that's gonna work out just fine. So let's zero that number back out and let's jump back to our main comp and see where we're at. So the apps slide over, and then we want to swipe up at this point. So we need to find that property, which is not going to be in the essential properties of this comp, because this weather cities comp is nested within the phone screen comp. So if we go into our weather cities, here we have the Y position for that layer, and we can't actually see it since it's off to the side, and I can't actually move this into the essential graphics panel because it's already an essential property. So a workaround for this is to just add another layer of control. So I'm going to add an expression control, the slider, apply that right to this cities layer, and I'll call this the same thing, widgets Y position. And now I can link this property using the property pick whip to this slider, and that will allow me to adjust that same property. And what I can do is right click on this and add that property to the essential graphics. I just need to make sure that I'm on the right comp, phone screen, and apply that here. So add property essential graphics. Now we've got widgets Y position. We're back in our screen source comp, and I have widgets Y position that allows me to shift this around, and everything else we set up is done automatically. So we can swipe up from here, we get over to the side, and then let's have that fingerprint marker swipe up on these widgets. So we'll go to right about here, set a position keyframe for this layer, and have it go up again. So we'll just have it travel up the screen, and then maybe come back down a little bit. And we'll just ease into these a little bit with the graph editor. So I'm going to strongly ease into that. I'll do a little bit of a softer ease in and out on this end, and that should move pretty well. Yep, that looks pretty good. That actually probably moves further than it needs to, so I'm gonna grab both of these keyframes at the same time so that I can manipulate both values at the same time and just drag that back down. And now it's not gonna travel quite so far up the screen. Okay, so now I just need to synchronize the motion of that swipe from this property right here. So let's line these keyframes up, and we'll give it a little bit of momentum so that it keeps sliding up and gets to a resting point at the bottom of the list, which is right about there. So let's ease into that with easy ease. Again, go into the graph editor and just crank that up and see what it looks like. Okay, I think at that point, I can probably just have the fingerprint indicator disappear completely. So let's just have it size down and fade out over a little bit more time as it's coming back down here. So let's find that size property, the opacity property, and have it just fade out and size down. So I'll bring it down and I'll fade it out and easy ease out of these keyframes, and that should work out pretty good. Yeah, so that disappeared, and now we can play this all back as a whole and take a look at what it looks like. So let's get a little bit more room here and see how it feels. Everything's working automatically. All right, why don't we just add in a little bit of camera movement so it's not so static. Let's grab our camera, press P to bring up the position and set a keyframe at the beginning. And then over these 6, 7, 8 seconds, let's just push in a little bit on the phone. And then why don't we add just a little bit of rotation with our rotation controls. So I think the Z rotation is what I'm looking for. Let's try modifying the Z rotation a little bit. Yep, so let's set a keyframe there and then find our second keyframe for our camera. Align to that and just rotate this slightly a little more straight on towards the camera. And then why don't we grab the X rotation? And yeah, tilt it towards us as well. So I'm gonna set a keyframe for the start of the animation and then tilt it forward a little bit. And I might need to back the camera out just a little bit more so it's not quite so close in there. But now we're just gonna have a little bit more movement on the phone as this presentation is taking place. And then just for good measure, why don't we also give a little bit of movement to the background so it's not quite so static. So let's go into the background layer, into the background elements, and I just wanna slowly have these elements drift. So it looks like we've got a BG blur layer that carried over from Figma, but these three layers here, let's just set a starting position keyframe and then we'll go forward about 8 or 9 seconds, and let's just shift them around. So I'm gonna grab this background one, and I'm gonna move it to the right a little bit. I'm gonna grab this foreground one, move it to the left. I'm gonna grab this one here, and maybe move it to the right as well. So that's just gonna give a little bit of motion. That's probably way more than it needs on that layer. But there we go, we've got just some very subtle movement, combine that with the background, and then we go back to our main comp, and now everything is moving just a little bit. And this is obviously gonna take a little bit longer to render since there's more to process, but I think this is working out pretty well. That subtle movement of the background adds some more depth, and the camera movement as well. I think I just wanna finish this off with an adjustment layer, so I'll go up to my void script, and I'm gonna do the second option here, which is variant. Again, this is just a shape layer alternative to an adjustment layer, and I'm going to add a CC vignette effect, and that will allow me to make a very quick, simple vignette. It's nothing fancy, it's very symmetrical, but it's just gonna allow me to darken the background a little bit. I think I'm gonna really crank up the darkness, and I'm gonna move the angle of view out, so that's just gonna give a little bit of darkness around the outside edges, drawing your eye towards the phone. And the other thing we really need is that drop shadow that was behind the phone element. Now, because we're using the advanced 3D render engine, I can't apply a drop shadow to this phone layer. If I try, let's say drop shadow, it's there, but we're not seeing it. So what I need to do is actually just pre-compose everything except for the background and that variant that I just added. So I'm gonna grab all these layers and press Control or Command Shift C to pre-compose, and I'll call this phone comp and click OK. And now all that motion is still there, but it exists on a 2D footage layer, a comp now, that I can add this drop shadow to. I'm gonna move it over to this side, back it off, and really feather it out. I'm gonna turn down the opacity, and I'm gonna make it more of a purple color, probably a little darker than that. And I might even duplicate that, offset it further, make it larger, and turn the opacity down again. And now we've got a very soft shadow separating that phone element from the background a little bit, and I think this looks really good. So let's take a look at this as a whole. The phone flies in, we've got a little bit of interaction, swipe from one screen to the next. Camera movement's really subtle, the background has some motion too. It's all feeling really nice, and I think this is a great application of bringing a Figma design into After Effects and using the capabilities of After Effects that Figma just doesn't have to showcase some interaction. I hope you got a lot out of this video and watching me transfer a very complex design file from Figma to After Effects using Overlord in my process for preparing that design to be animated inside of After Effects. There is no better way to get stuff from Figma to After Effects, so if you don't have Overlord yet, head to battleaxe.co/overlord to learn more. Thanks so much for watching this video. I hope you have a fantastic day, and I'll see you in the next one.